Now in this section we're going to create a damaged section of the wall. This is part of the wall where some of the plaster has crumbled away, showing the rock underneath it. We're going to start out in Photoshop in the text lib folder. If you navigate to stone rock walls, we're going to open up oldstonewall.png. This is going to be the base image for our texture for the wall. I'm going to change the image size to 512 by 512, and then I'm going to crank the width up in the canvas size to 1024. I'm going to duplicate that layer and move it to the right. Now I'm going to fix the seam in the center. Now I go over it with the clone brush with just one pass, but then I go through and add all the small details, because we're not just simply working with like a wood texture or a stone texture. We got to make sure that all of these rocks mesh together realistically. So I'm just taking a sample from one rock and I'm painting it over the seam, just so it looks like there's actually rocks there and that we didn't just go through with a clone brush and didn't pay attention to any of the details. And now with the selection tool, I'm going to go through and I'm going to make a cutout of the wall. And I'm going to delete the top part of it. But before I deleted it, I made a duplicate of that layer and I hid it just for a backup in case we screw up creating the outline for this. Now I'm going over it with an eraser, just to kind of give it a better, more realistic outline, as if the plaster had fallen off of each rock. I end up going through this multiple times, creating a different outline and a different way of roughing up the edges. Just created a new layer and filled it with black. Now I'm going through with a textured brush and I'm giving a rough edge to the outline we just made with a textured eraser brush. Now I create a new layer. I'm going to play with the blending types. Put it on multiply and I change the fill percent. I join that with the layer beneath it. Now I create a new layer and I selected the layer beneath it so that I could paint over it and add a bit of a shadow. I didn't use a layer style, I actually painted that shadow on. Now I'm going over it with an eraser brush to make it more subtle. Playing with the levels again. I'm playing with the blending mode and the fill percent of the shadow layer. End up sticking with multiply at about 57%. I'm going to save that as stonewallcol.psd, and I'm going to save a PNG version of that in the textures folder. Now I brought back our backup layer. I'm going to rename this to stonewalldisplacement.psd. Now we're going to work on creating a displacement map to use in Blender to create a normal map just like we did for the wall. I'm going to create an outline that's a bit bigger than the cutout section that we have. That's just to act as a margin for when we're using it as a displacement map and baking it. I'm going to go into Blender. I just want to get a good visual of how this looks on the wall. So on one of the side walls, I'm going to place the cursor, create a plane, and I'm going to scale it up to 2 times the width. And I'm going to stick it right against the wall and right behind the sheet metal. Now I'm going to apply Stonewall Cal to those UVs. I just rotated it 180 degrees to fix it. So that's what it looks like against the wall now. Now the PNG does have alpha data on it. Just like when we were testing out the windows, we're just temporarily keeping the alpha data in this image, but we're going to create alpha maps for it later. So I just created a new material for it called Stonewall. I put the diffuse intensity up to 1, specularity down to 0, and we're adding a new texture called Stonewall Cal. We're going to load in the Stonewall image. We're going to enable alpha in the influence panel under diffuse. And back in the material settings, we're going to enable transparency and turn alpha down to 0. So here's what it looks like so far against our wall. One of the main problems is the color. We want that to blend a little bit more in with the wall, so we end up making it a tiny bit orange later by using a sample of the wall texture and applying it over top of the stone wall. And we are in fact going to do that right now. So I opened up the stone wall texture, I copied the whole thing, and I pasted it on top of the stone wall. And I cut out a selection of it. Now we're going to play with the blending types. I put it on overlay, and we're going to save that and see how it looks. I just joined them together, and now I'm going to make a new outline for it. I didn't like the way that outline looked. So we're going to cut another chunk off of it with this new outline. I'm going to go through again with a textured brush, create a rough edge. I'm going to save that, load it back in the Blender, and see how it looks. That blends in a lot better. It doesn't have to blend in perfectly. I mean, we don't really want it to. Not every color has to be similar to each other. Now I create a layer style with a slight shadow. Now if you notice when we were previewing it in Blender, there was a bit of a white outline around it. We can fix that by creating a bit of a margin. And how we're going to do that is by using the backup layer that we have hidden. There it is. I just enabled it. We're going to apply the same changes that we made for the foreground layer by making it orange with a sample of the wall and changing the levels and things like that. And we're going to make a cutout that is maybe 10 to 20 pixels wider than our original cutout. See, I'm making a cutout right now. We're going to delete the stone around that just because we don't need all that extra color data. And now I'm going to create an alpha map. And on an alpha map, the white parts are the parts that are visible and the black parts are transparent. And I base the alpha map on the foreground layer, not the extra margin that we made. I'm going to reload that in Blender. So we're about to make an alpha map for it. I'm just seeing how everything looks in here, and I'm disabling alpha in the influence panel under diffuse. I'm going to create a new layer called Stonewall Alpha. I'm going to open up the alpha map that we just created, Stonewall Alpha.png. We're going to enable alpha and disable color. Now you can see there's no white outline. That's because of the excess material we have surrounding the outline of our color map, that extra stone border around it. Make sure all the coordinates are at UV. Now I did change the UV layer name to color, although it's not necessary because we actually don't bake AO or shadow maps onto these. Although you could, I just end up not doing it and just changing the material settings to make them darker. Now I desaturated this, and I'm playing with levels to make it very extreme. We're going to make our displacement map now, and we're working with the displacement.psd. I'm going to make the background black. I'm going to save this as a PNG called Stonewall Displace. Now we're going to create a new file in Blender. We're going to create our normal map by doing a bit of sculpting and using the displacement modifier. I'm going to scale that to twice the width. I'm going to put a cut in the center of it just to make subdividing more organized. I subdivided it 4 or 5 times. I'm going to create a material and a texture for it. I'm going to load the texture into a displacement modifier. Change the direction to Z and the UV and the texture coordinates to UV. And you can see it's starting to bump out already. Now, just so that I can subdivide this even further, I'm going to get rid of all of the vertices that aren't really being used in the displacement map. I'm going to subdivide it again, and again get rid of more of these excessive vertices. Now I'm going to add a blur filter to this, just to make the displacement a bit more neat. When you have a lot of sharp details, it tends to make the vertices in your object that's being displaced really extreme and really sharp. So I'm just subdividing it as many times as I can until I start seeing details from the stone wall texture. Put the strength down to 0.05. Now before we go into sculpt mode, we have to actually apply that displacement modifier. Now we can go in and sculpt. What I'm going to do is all of these rocks I see that are bumping out, I'm just going to go over it with the add brush, and I'm going to make them bump out a little bit more. That'll make our normal map a bit more extreme and a bit more realistic. Because although it's a good technique to use a displacement modifier to render out a normal map instead of just using the filter to convert it in Photoshop, it's still not going to give you the greatest result unless you also go over it with the sculpt brush and make the details more prominent. Now, you don't have to go over every single detail. It would just be good to go over most of the big rocks and make them stand out a bit more. I'll create a new plane on top of that, stretch it to twice the width, and I'm going to bake it just like we did with the wall. And change bake mode to normals, normal space to tangent, margin to 4. I'm going to bake that. So now we're going to add some extra details to the normal map by opening it up in Photoshop and copying the color map and pasting it on top. And now we're going to convert this same way we've converted other normal maps using the Photoshop filter. I'm going to desaturate it, play with the levels a little bit, make a duplicate of the layer at scale 7 and sample 7, create a normal map, and then I use the overlay blend mode. And with the duplicate layer, I made another conversion at sample 4, and also use the soft light blending mode for that. So with all three of those normal maps mixed together, I save that image, and we're going to load it into Blender now. So I created a new texture called Stone Wall Nor. We're going to load that image in. Change coordinates to UV, layer to color, enable normal map at tangent space, disable color in the influence panel, and enable normal in the geometry within the influence panel. And you can see the normal map doesn't look quite right. Might be the way I have the lighting, or it may be that we didn't invert the layers in Blender, the red channels I mean. So back in Blender, I'm going to real quick invert those red channels. Back in Photoshop, I'm going to invert those red channels. We're going to save that, load it back in Blender, and see if that fixes things. It was definitely the lighting, so here I am playing with the lights. I changed the normal value down to 0.8 in the textures. Now I'm going through and I'm making a specularity map. Call that stone wall spec. We're going to load that into the texture stack. Now our texture is looking pretty good. I'm going to duplicate that, move it down the line to the end wall there, rotate it 90 degrees, and I'm going to stick it up in a corner. And now we can just move these decals all over the environment. You can see that normal map, by baking it through Blender, makes it really pop out. Now I'm creating an I'm creating a normal map of the alpha map, just so I can overlay it onto our normal map to make the outline have a bit of an edge to it, as if the plaster actually fell off. So you can see a bit of an outline there from the new addition to the normal map. And right there I just used a higher sample to make it a bit more blurred and a bit more bigger. So you can see our plaster has a bit of an edge to it now, giving this a bit more depth. You can put so much detail into a texture using a normal map. That's why I'm really going all out for the normal map for these. I have 4 different layers in that normal map. One for the edge of the plaster. I have 2 from the conversions I made in Photoshop. And the main normal map is the one we baked in Blender. And altogether it really makes these parts of the walls really stand out. Here I'm creating a layer style with an inner shadow on a blending mode linear burn, just to give the plaster some kind of casted shadow. Ends up not looking so well. I'm going to go through and create a new outline. It wasn't a whole lot different. The main difference was that it wasn't catering to each and every stone. I just went through and took off chunks of plaster in real straight lines to make it a bit more blocky, which is kind of how I've noticed plaster tends to fall off of a wall. I'm creating a new alpha map for this, just by making the opaque section white and the surrounding section black. I'm going to save that, open it back up, and we're going to create another normal map for it, because we have to now reapply that to our main normal map since we changed the outline. And when I converted it to a normal map, I inverted the colors again. So let's save that and reload it in the Blender, see how it looks. Normal map is looking pretty sweet, but I just can't get that edge correct. Now I just had an idea to put a couple chunks of plaster in the center of the texture to make it look like there were a couple chunks left when it collapsed, when it broke off of the wall. Ends up not looking so good, but I was just playing around at this point because the normal map came out so good that it was inspiring to kind of try and add more detail to it. So here I just took a couple parts of the color map from the wall. I stuck it on this stone wall. I try to make it really fit in. And it may have worked if I actually persevered and made a normal map for it, but after I looked at the color map I decided it wasn't such a good idea. So I saved that as the color map. I load it back into Blender. And I mean, I didn't have an accommodating normal map, so it just looked discouraging. I decided to delete it. We have enough detail on there. An awesome normal map. I'm going through the alpha map with a textured brush. Now I'm going to go over it one more time with a textured eraser brush. I loaded the alpha map into the wall call image, and I selected it. I made it a selection, and then I deleted the outline of the stone wall color texture, just so the layer style I created with the shadow could be consistent with the alpha map. Now I inverted the colors on the alpha map, and I created a normal map conversion for it, so I can put it on top of our normal map stack. And now I'm going to reload all the textures and see how that looks. And that blends in a lot better. I cranked the normal map up to 1, it looks freaking sweet. That was just a simple textured brush that I used to go over the outline with, just to make it look more crumbly, and it appears to have worked perfectly. So covered in this section now, we're going to randomize the window textures, we're going to create a new ground texture, and we're going to modify the ground mesh to make kind of beaten paths to accommodate the beaten paths that we painted on with dirt. Now in randomizing the window textures, I'm basically just going to join a bunch of window models together after I make them all individual users here. So I made them all single users for object and object data in the object menu in the 3D view. And now I'm going to join a bunch of random ones together, and I'm just going to move their UVs around so that the window pane textures are all randomized. So I join them together and I hide them. We'll play with the UVs after we join a few groups together. Now I'm lazy, so I'm not going to randomize every pane for every single window, so I join them together in groups. So now I'm going to go back through them one group at a time. I'm going to move all the panes around, and I'm even going to rotate some of them just to make everything random. Because as of right now, every pane is in the exact same position for every window. And we have 6 different window pane textures on this color map, so we should make best use out of them by randomizing them as much as possible. Now I'm going through and make sure everything is randomized enough. Now we're going to create a new ground texture. So now I'm going to go through the ground folder in the text lib folder and open up cracked dirt and also gray dirt. And in the textures folder, I'm going to open up the PSD for I'm going to open up the PNG for ground dirt col. I'm going to paste the cracked dirt image into the ground dirt col image. I'm going to get rid of some of the details with the clone brush. And as usual, we're going to get rid of the seams. I'm going to take a sample from the gray dirt image, see if we can add some extra detail to this cracked earth image. I'm just going to put it on top with blending mode soft light. Now I'm playing with the blending modes, see if I can get something that works. Now I have it back on soft light at 55%. I put it down to 35%. I duplicated the cracked earth layer, and I played with the normals to make it more contrasting. Desaturating it a bit and playing with the normals again. I'm going to save that as grounddirtcol.png. We're going to load it in and see how it looks. I have crappy lighting, so it's really hard to gauge whether or not this is going to be good enough. But we can always change it later if we need to. But basically, any photo texture you use for the ground is going to end up good enough as long as it looks like it fits into the environment, and as long as you have good lighting and some nice shadows. The only time you really have to worry about the quality of your ground textures, I mean really fixate on the quality of them, is when you have a really open environment. Like if I were to have a warehouse like this, as open as it is right now, we would need a much better texture for the ground. But since we have so many details we're going to be adding, so many different props we're going to be laying on top of it, and so many shadows being cast from like 6 different lights, and ambient occlusion as well, all you really need is a good color map with a decent amount of details on it. But otherwise you don't really need to fixate on how good it is. So now I'm going to go through, I'm going to create the specular map and normal maps. And we're going to reload them into Blender and see how everything looks. You can see how it kind of looks like motion blur there. That's because I had the sizes of the X and Y a bit offset. So you have to make sure if you change the X and Y size for in the mapping panel for your textures, that all of the textures that you have together for normal, specular, and color map, that they're all the same size. Else you're going to get that weird motion blur look to it. So I'm going to go through and I'm actually going to edit the mesh of the ground to kind of dig paths into it to match the paths that we painted with splatting. So I'm going to select these two loops of vertices and I'm going to move them straight down. You're going to have to go through and you're going to have to fix these lakes by just pulling up a few vertices here and there. And we don't want these to be dug into the ground too deep, because our character is going to be walking through here and we don't want it to be like he's walking over a mountain or something. Just deep enough to be noticeable. Now I'm going to create a brand new specular map based on the new color map for the ground.